If, like me, you're a massive Dead Space fan with more Ishimura visitor stamps than limbs on your average necromorphs, more opportunities to grab your plasma cutter, pull on Isaac's boots and get dismembering are always welcome, especially when it's been lovingly remade in the style of your classic PS1 horror games of old. I've played Dead Space on the PS3, I've played the Dead Space Remake on the PS5, but this Demake by indie dev Fraser Brumley, appropriately titled Dead Space 1998, is quite honestly everything I've ever wanted. It's Dead Space but made for the PS1, and if that sounds appealing to you, then guess what? We're about to become best friends. Everything you loved about the original and remake are here. You've got your classic sound design creating that nerve-shredding Ishimura atmosphere, but instead of modern control systems and top-of-the-range graphics, it's been cut right back to what you'd expect a PS1 to be able to run with everything that entails. If you thought Isaac controlled like a tank in the original Dead Space on PS3, imagine trying to control him with directional buttons instead of an analog stick. It makes every encounter with necromorphs even more deadly, since forcing Isaac to aim at one of them is about as easy as actually trying to reliably cut off a limb at 20 paces while in space. That's really bloody difficult, just like it was back in the old days on our PS1s. And that's before we get to the visuals, which, bizarrely, to me anyway, are even scarier than the original or the remake. I don't know what it is about that PS1 era of horror games and the aesthetic they haunted my waking hours with, but like a cross between Silent Hill and the original Doom, there's just something about polygons, flickering lights in the darkness, and trying to control an unruly PS1 era camera that really gets under my skin. But in a good way, obviously. Sadly, the Demake is about as long as your average PS1 game as well, only encompassing the first chapter of the original Dead Space, joining Isaac as he picks up his plasma cutter for the first time and ending just as you send Hammond and Kendra happily into the meat grinder that is the bridge. But there's plenty of time for scares along the way, with pretty much every jump scare you can think of lovingly demade into the creepy, uncanny valley polygons you see here. It might be short, but it's a fun little adventure around the Ishimura from an entirely new perspective, and took me right back to my living room circa 1998, where I first snatched a few moments of Doom on my dad's PlayStation, before being forcibly removed from it lest I begin thirsting for the blood of the innocent. Anyway, where was I? Sadly, the Dead Space Demake was mainly an exercise in practice for Aussie dev Fraser Brumley to learn Unreal Engine's inner workings and work on that nostalgia-fueling PS1 aesthetic that drags gamers of a certain vintage kicking and screaming back into their childhoods whenever they see it. But you can play it for yourself if you fancy a nightmare-riddled trip down suppressed memory lane. It makes you wonder, with demakes becoming more and more popular, The Last of Us, Elden Ring, even Resident Evil 4, whether devs should start looking at making stripped-back versions of modern games as well as juiced-up versions of our old-school classics, even if it's just DLC or an endgame secret you can unlock. So, to hell with remasters and remakes. Which games would you want to see get official demakes? Let us know down in the comments. And if you're a fan of horror classics, check out these videos on the Resident Evil 4 remake.